Everyone, my name is Franca Tamaris. I'm the Events Assistant at the Melbourne Energy Institute. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar will discuss key findings from AEMO's Q4 2021 Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report. Presenting these findings is Mr. Kevin Lee, Group Manager, Reform Development and Insights at AEMO. His role covers many aspects of energy markets, including market design, policy and regulation, working with the Energy Security Board, the Australian Energy Market Commission and the Australian Energy Regulator on market reforms. Kevin is also responsible for the development and publication of the Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report. Moderating today's webinar will be Dr. Adrian Penau, Director, Major Projects at the Melbourne Energy Institute. A couple of points before we begin, as this seminar will not be you will not be able to speak during the session. However, we would like to make it as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A option in your webinar panel to ask questions. We'll try to address them all during the Q&A breaks. If you have any technical issues, you can send an email to the to mei-info@unimelb.edu.au and we'll try to assist. Thank you for joining us. And now please welcome Kevin and Adrian.
Thanks, Franca, and thanks, Adrian. It's a pleasure for myself to be presenting today. So we published the Quarterly Energy Dynamics 2001 Q4 report that was published late January, and today's presentation is snippets of some of the trends and observations that we've seen in that report. So just some highlights to start off with. The main observations that we saw were NEM demands were down compared to the previous quarter in Q4 2020. Having said that, we did see Q4 volatility and prices pick up throughout the quarter. Second key observation is quite big price divergences between regions. There's a bit of a north-south type divide where prices in northern states are somewhat larger than the ones in southern states. And we continue to see a divergence in time of day pricing also. Third observation is renewables growth continues to displace thermal generation. And we did notice that gas generation in South Australia did reduce. And that's partly due to the completion of synchronous condensers, which were commissioned in late November 21. Finally, the East Coast gas prices were quite elevated, sitting at about $10.50 per gigajoule. But somewhat lower than the international parity prices. So this slide on the left-hand side shows that we continue to see operational demand generally lower across the whole NEM. So you see here New South Wales operational demand compared to Q4 2020 was some 230 megawatts lower. And that's primarily due to distributed PV. So in 2021, the CER estimated that there were about 3,000 megawatts of installed distributed rooftop PVs, which is quite a large number. On the right-hand side is the minimum operational demands. So there's a clear trend here. If you take a look at the top curve, that's New South Wales region. It recorded the lowest ever minimum operational demand, 4,425 megawatts, recorded on the 17th of October. And more importantly, if you look at the trend, the last 3 years, there is quite a noticeable trend in dropping minimum operational demands. And there's a similar story in Victoria. That trend is very clear, very evident. And Victoria recorded the minimum on record of 2,333 megawatts on the 28th of November. This is really quite an interesting set of graphs from AEMO's perspective as the system and market operator. So what this shows is the intraday swing or range in power demand. So you can see that in 2001, and we picked the Queensland region basically as an example. There's a range of 3,600 megawatts from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. at night, which is really quite a large range. So as the market operator, we have to operate the system securely, reliably, and reliably. And these large ranges in required demand presents potential challenges to keeping the system secure. And as you can see from the right-hand graph, the minimum was at 10:30 in the morning, and there's a steep ramp to about 7 o'clock at night. So what this tells AEMO is we need to look at additional system services which complements the current services that we have, the current 8 Fcas markets that we have. And the reason for that is there's a need to incentivize service providers and generators to make their generation available to supply these sort of ramps. On this graph shows the NEM mainland prices. So you can see in Q4, prices average $57 per megawatt hour. This was down on Q3 prices, but still quite high. And when you compare it to Q4 2020, it was 31% higher. The graph on the right shows the prices and the volatility really across the 5 regions. What's noticeable is Queensland. You can see that the red bar is the energy prices below $300 per megawatt hour. And this, sorry. Trying to get my cursor. There you go. And the hash bar is the contribution of prices above 300. So you can see that the energy component without volatility was quite high in Queensland, but the volatility component, prices above 300, was also quite significant across the quarter. There's a number of reasons for this price divergence that we mentioned earlier between the southern states and the northern states. It's primarily due to factors like more black coal generation in the northern states, and of course their marginal cost is higher than variable renewable generation, and also transmission constraints due to transmission outages means that supply is localized to the Queensland region as opposed to being globally sourced from all regions. So this is a further breakdown of the spot price volatility that we saw in Q4. And you can see that in terms of cap returns is what's the return on a cap that's bought by a market participant. And how that's calculated is really if prices are above $300 per megawatt hour, that's the strike price, then the seller of the cap has to pay the buyer of the cap that amount above 300. So what it shows is that cap returns have been second highest since 2009. So they were quite large at $40 per megawatt hour, and the bulk of that was in Queensland. The right-hand graph shows that when you have high penetration of VRE within the system, and when you have things like cloud cover, and you have the wind not blowing as strong as what is anticipated, then the underlying scheduled demand might be higher than what is typical of that day. So the dotted line is a typical scheduled demand day for South Australia. So you can see that you normally have a lot of solar PV and gas, and the scheduled demand is lower during the middle of the day. But on this particular day, on the 13th of December, we had cloud cover, we had low wind. So scheduled demand was actually quite high. And couple with that, the overall supply of the system was tight for that day. So when you have tight supply and demand, you have volatility in the spot price, and that's what we see here from the red line, where the absence of wind and solar coupled with tight supply meant that there were quite volatile spot prices. This slide here shows the price divergence that you get within the day itself. So you can see here, typically when during the middle of the day with lots of sunshine, that prices are typically low. And as the day ramps up and operational demand picks up, and also as you approach the evening, when there's no solar generation, there's different generators which set the price, and you typically see the price increase. So this is a very typical price curve. What's noticeable is the daytime prices continue its trend of being low, and they are somewhat lower than the same time back in 2020 Q4. The right-hand chart is the Victorian spot prices, and it's even more pronounced. So you have between the period of 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the afternoon, the average price was actually minus $6 per megawatt hour. Adrian, I don't know if you wanted me to pause and to take questions. Do you want me to do one more slide, Adrian, before I?
Perhaps do one more as a natural break. We don't have any questions online at this point, so if anyone does have them, please put them in the Q&A down the bottom.
Yep. Okay. This next couple of slides shows the futures prices. So what you can see is that the futures price for basically all regions in the NEM, they increase, and this futures price is for the calendar year 22 ASX futures contracts. So prices did increase as you progress during the quarter, and that goes back to what I mentioned earlier. The volatility did pick up during the quarter four. What's noticeable is that the Queensland futures prices and the New South Wales futures prices are somewhat larger than the southern states of Victoria and South Australia. This right-hand chart shows that the interconnector flows that you have plays quite an important role. It allows cheap energy to be supplied to a higher price region. So you can see here with the Q&I exports from Victoria into New South Wales, when the export is high, you tend to have less of a price divergence between New South Wales and Victoria. And conversely, when the interconnector flow is low, you get a higher price spread between New South Wales and the Victorian region. There's a number of reasons why the limits on the interconnector varies. You have things like constraint equations, which ensures that the system is operated securely and it's within limits. So you have situations where whenever there's high penetration of solar generation in either Northern Victoria or Southwest New South Wales, because of the limits on the transmission system, and there might be voltage, there might be stability, there might be some other thermal limits. It just coincides whenever you have high penetration of solar in those regions, the limits on the transmission interconnector, it needs to be pulled back. And when that happens, like I mentioned, you have this price divergence between the north and south. So I'll stop there, Adrian, to take any questions.
Good, thanks, Kevin. And quite a few questions have started to flow through. Perhaps if we start with an earlier one where you talked about the system needs to change in response to a greater penetration VRE, greater swings. Is the technology already in place and the market isn't responding, or do we actually need to incentivize somehow the build out of different technologies?
Yeah, what I was referring to, Adrian, was if you take a look at our market, there's the energy market, and you have 8 Fcas markets. So you've got 2 regulation markets, you've got 6 contingency Fcas markets. What I was referring to, and it's debate that's currently being had, is do you need other explicit market services, like for instance a ramping service or an operational reserve service? And the purpose of the service or the market is it sends an explicit price signal to the market that this particular service is required and it's valuable, and you will be compensated if you supply the service. As we move more towards more variable renewable generation and we're getting steeper ramps, I personally think the need for explicit market services which explicitly value that service will definitely be required.
And perhaps that refers to one of the questions that's been posted about wholesale demand response. What do you feel its future is in the NEM, and what's its place? Is that the same answer or slightly different question?
It's same answer, but it's a slightly different flavour. The wholesale demand response was a mechanism that was commissioned in October 2021. So its purpose is to allow large loads to supply and make themselves more responsive, and it does that by having a counterfactual baseline. So it basically says, basically all else being equal, my demand would have been X. If there's wholesale spot price volatility and the prices is high, then I'm willing to provide demand response. So instead of using X, I only use Y. and that Y is lower than X. So the difference in the demand levels is then paid at the spot price. So it's a mechanism to incentivize more responsive demand side response. So I see that having a role to play. It was only commissioned 4 months ago. I think that market will continue to mature, and we will have more and more service providers coming in and participating.
Right, thank you. An earlier question that perhaps many in the audience would find it strange that we have negative prices at all in the NEM. So it's a question around what actually happens during those times. Yeah,
it's a good question. The market is set up with what we call price settings. Okay, so you have the maximum price cap. It currently sits at about $15,500 per megawatt hour, and then you have the the market floor price, which is negative $1,000 per megawatt hour. So that's your pricing envelope. So when the overall price is negative, what it means is if you're lucky enough to be a consumer and you're buying your product from the wholesale market, then the market is willing to pay you to consume power. Now, it sounds too good to be true, but the reason for that is the generator or the generators behind that negative pricing, it's cheaper for them to pay someone to consume rather than have their plant cycle, because some plants have to have a minimum output to be stable. Once it falls below that minimum, they'll either have to go offline. If they go offline, they have to incur startup costs and so forth. So all up, it says it's cheaper for the generator to pay someone to consume power rather than have to come offline. So that's the purpose of that negative price.
All right, thank you. A couple of other questions here, and perhaps you may not have the data to hand, but an interesting one is around what the trend is of evening prices and whether they're actually getting higher and higher every year, or was this quarter an anomaly? You had the comparison between 2020 and 21.
Yeah.
What does it look like over a longer period?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that there's really many facets to that question in terms of is that just a observation that's relevant for one quarter? I think it really depends on the generation mix moving into the future. You can see a scenario in the future where if you had enough large batteries, they could be soaking up the excess generation during the day and then supplying the excess generation during the evening, and that will have the effect of introducing more supply and basically all else being equal, lowering that evening price. That could happen in the future. For the time being, there's probably not enough large-scale batteries to compete with the current mix of generation that can supply the peak. And that mix of generation that supplies the peak is your thermal generation, your gas generation, your hydro intermediate peaking type generation. So this market is very dynamic. The plant mix keeps on changing. So it may well be that really over time you will see that flattening out of that daytime versus the nighttime prices.
All right. There are a couple of other questions. I'll ask these three in this break, but if the audience has others, we'll hold them over for the next set, and they may well be answered anyway. You mentioned some changes already happening. The 5-minute settlements, whether they've started to have any impact, any material impact that you're seeing?
Yeah. I think we have a slide later on the 5-minute settlement.
Okay, we'll come back to that one.
We'll come back to that
good.
one.
While you've got that slide up at the moment and talking about interconnects, a question about when the larger interconnectors will actually become operational.
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe the Power Energy Connect PEC, the one from South Australia to New South Wales, off the top of my head, I believe it's progressively been commissioned. I think the first time it comes online is late 2023. Don't quote me on that. That's just my recollection. So I think that would definitely help. It's some 800 megawatts of additional sharing of supply between South Australia and New South Wales. So I think that would definitely help with the sharing of power between those two regions. The Q&I miner upgrade, I believe, that would increase the transfer capacity between New South Wales and Queensland by about 150 to 200 megawatts. I believe that it's currently work's been done, relevant transmission upgrades to make that happen. And I understand it might be later this year where that Q&I miner interconnector is upgraded. There's other transmission works as part of the Western Victoria transmission system that may or may not help the overall transfer capacities between Victoria and New South Wales. But I understand that the commissioning for those works is late 2022. And then, of course, in the ISP, there's a number of major transmission projects. You've got the larger VNI West, so that's a major transmission line from Western Victoria through to Western New South Wales through to Victoria. And I understand that the thermal capacity of that line is something like 1,500 megawatts. So it's quite a large transmission project. I believe the latest ISP has that coming in at about 2030 or 2032. There's the HumeLink, which is a major transmission project from southern New South Wales into Sydney West. I think that's about 800 megawatts of additional transfer into that major load centre. And I understand that that transmission project is targeting 2026. There is Marinus Link, 2 cables, and I think the first cable is scheduled for about 2028 or 29. So there's definitely major transmission on the cards, which I think would help the overall competition.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll come back to the slides and I'll hold over the remaining questions until next break. Back to you, Kevin.
Okay. Thank you, Adrian. So this is the 5-minute settlement slide that we just mentioned. So on the left-hand side is what we typically saw prior to the 5-minute settlement change taking effect in October last year. So what we saw was whenever you had a price spike, and in particular if that price spike was early within the trading interval, the averaging of the 6 5-minute prices for the half hour meant that generators had an incentive to then bid to the floor price of negative $1,000 at the later trading intervals. And the reason for that is they still get a good average price for the half hour, but they're maximising their generation output. So we saw this type of behaviour. It's quite it creates fluctuations, and what 5-minute settlement has done is, as shown on the right hand side, yes, you still get price spikes, but you don't get this disorderly bidding behavior where generators rush in and try to maximize their generation output. So we'll keep track of this phenomenon in Q1 to see if this pattern behavior is essentially seen. This slide shows that what we noticed in Q4 last year was that we noticed that VRE generators started to shift their offers. So you could see before that you had up to about 8,000, 9,000 megawatts of capacity priced at that negative $1,000 per megawatt hour, and that's denoted by the green. So what we noticed going into Q4 was less volume priced at a negative 1,000. So from typically about 8,000 on average to around about 4,000 on average. And that volume is now being priced up in that negative $50 to negative $100 per megawatt hour. This next slide is the sunset diagram, and it shows the average output by time of day for Q4 2021 compared to Q4 2020. So it won't come as a surprise that if you take a look at the generation mix, grid solar, it increased by about 600, 700 megawatts compared to 2020. Distributed PV also increased. It's about 1,500 megawatts of additional capacity. So 1,500 megawatts is quite large. We are talking a Yallourn type power station, so it's quite significant. Compared to Q4 2020, we did see hydro output increase, and that's mainly due to the La Nina conditions and Hydro Tasmania exporting into Victoria, and Tas Hydro would typically do that during the early hours up to about 8 AM, and they would do that starting in the evening. Wind output also increased relative to Q4 2020, as seen by that green. So a reduction compared to the quarter in 2021, reduction in brown coal generation output, and a reduction in black coal generation output. So you can see black thermal generation, quite a significant drop in output. So we're talking about 1,000 megawatts of a reduction in output. And gas-fired generation also saw a reduction in output, as seen by that darker grey line. So this right-hand graph shouldn't present any surprises. Wind output, we saw increases across the whole NEM, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, compared to Q4 2020. And similar story with the grid cell solar output. It was most noticeable in New South Wales, where you had about 130 megawatts of increased output. So this next couple of diagrams is a continuation of what we just talked about in the previous slide. Black coal output, it continues to fall. So in Q4, it was the lowest output on record, some 10,000 megawatts of generation. And the trend is also very clear. So if you take the last four years, this trend is very clear. With regards to gas-fired generation, as I mentioned earlier before, with the commissioning of the synchronous condensers in South Australia, we did notice that prior to the syncons being commissioned, the average gas output in South Australia was about 350 megawatts. And then after commissioning, that has dropped to about 150 megawatts. I believe this might be my final slide. This shows the Fcas costs across the NEM. So you can see that Fcas costs is still quite high. In the quarter was about $130 million, and that's primarily due to Queensland. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mentioned before the Q&I miner upgrade. So whenever you have a transmission outage for upgrades or forced outage, it means that the Fcas cannot be supplied globally. So normally Fcas can be supplied really from Victoria or New South Wales to meet the requirements in Queensland. Whenever you have localized constraints due to transmission outages, then it means that global supply is not possible, and you need to source local supply from Queensland. So for that reason, we've seen quite a large increase in the Fcas costs for Queensland, and that's depicted in the slide on the right, where the contingency raise and the contingency lower were quite large, at about 58 and 20 million per for a couple of days. This next slide is the East Coast gas prices. So I mentioned in my opening observations that the current average price across the NEM is about $10.50 per gigajoule. That's really quite high. But the one saving grace is that it's much lower than the ACCC price, where if you take the international prices and you net back it to the Curtis Island, then that net back price is sitting around the $35 mark, which is exceptionally high. In Victoria, we did see quite high gas usage during the quarter. So we did have a cold October and November, and as a result, depicted by this Iona gas storage, which is a very large storage facility in Victoria. This red line shows that storage facility did get used up during November. I think that's all my slides, Adrian.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a comprehensive overview of a quarter which has added, you know, every quarter that we do this webinar for. I think the consistent theme here is that volatility has increased, the complexity of the system has increased, and the ability of AEMO to keep the lights on it, certainly at the transmission level, is even more remarkable given all of those changes that are going on. So compliments to AEMO for doing your job very well in trying circumstances. Perhaps if we might leave the presentation up, because some of the questions refer to certainly some of the content, and it might be even useful to go back to some of the slides if possible. But got about 10, 12 questions there, which I'll try and group to some extent, but perhaps that the second last slide talks to this one to some extent. Are you able to comment on how virtual power plants are performing, and whether they're having, again, material impact, and whether they're having an impact on the Fcas markets?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. The virtual power plants, I think they're definitely helping. The size of the virtual power plants is not at scale at the moment. We're only talking maybe 5-10 megawatts. So it's helping at the margin, but we're talking about the Fcas requirement being about 150 megawatts, which is quite large. So I think over time, when you have more innovation and you have distributors and you have retailers and you have different aggregators coming into the market and they're trialing new virtual power plants, I think we will get that. We will see that segment grow, and we will see that 5 or 10 megawatts become 20, 30, 50 megawatts. And that would then introduce an additional source of competition. And I think over time, we will see even more competitive market, and then we will naturally see competition then that would then result in a lowering of prices.
Right. If any of Kevin's comprehensive answers don't actually address, or I've worded your question wrongly, feel free to repost it or seek clarification. But, thank you. There's a group of questions that are perhaps more forward-looking and talk to the ISP, and maybe not the current one, but the one further out. And obviously, you know, making news today is Earring's closure. So there are a few questions asking whether you can comment on both the almost immediate outlook for wholesale prices, but also looking further out, and whether a closure of a plant of that scale is going to perhaps bring forward some of the more prospective renewable energy technologies such as wind, offshore wind.
Yeah, that's quite a handful of that question. Yeah, the announcement was made by Origin today. It is a big power plant. I think it supplies about 16,000 megawatt hours of energy, which is quite large. The NEM as a whole is about 200,000. So, you know, you're talking quite a substantial amount of energy that has to be replaced. Understand, you know, it's bringing forward their retirement date, and there's a range of factors, I think, leading to Origin to come up with that closure date. It's within that 42-month window where a business will have to give notice to the market. In terms of impact, look, it's going to be something that I think will have to be looked at. it wasn't anticipated in the ISP, draft ISP that was published back in December. I believe the ISP modelling had a Raring closing 2030 or 2032. So it's bringing forward that closure by 5 years. So of course the final ISP, which is due to be published in June this year, would have to take that into account. What's the impact on wholesale prices? It would definitely have an impact. I think, you know, you can't always rely on past history as a extrapolator of what may or may not happen for the future. But if you go back and look at Hazelwood closure in 2017, and you take a look at the Playford closure around at the same time, they were major thermal plants, and their closure did result in quite market increases in the forward prices. So I'm not saying that this time around that will be the case, but I think you will see a period of volatility. And I understand that Origin is flagging that closure date. I had a quick read. I'm not sure if it's definitive in terms of 2025 is absolutely their closure date. So there's a bit of a question mark in terms of how concrete that date is also. So hopefully that answers the person's question.
Thank you. And as I said, if it doesn't, we have some time left if you'd like to rephrase or ask a follow-up. There was a specific technology mentioned in one of the questions around offshore wind generation. If it comes off, it could be huge, but what's AEMO's view perhaps of the offshore wind prospect?
Yeah, it's a good question. We know there's a couple of potential projects. I think there's one called Star of the South or something like that in Victoria, and there's another one in the east coast of Australia. Look, you know, those projects are massive. We're talking 1,000, 2,000 megawatts. So they're absolutely massive. I think ultimately there's no shortage of renewable projects. You know, there's like 150 potential new onshore projects right now. And then if you add offshore on top of that, it's going to add to the overall volume of potential projects. I think ultimately what limitations you have comes back down to transmission and connection. There's only a finite amount of space in terms of where to connect into the NEM, and only a finite amount of transmission capacity, which would then allow you to transport cheaper energy from a low price region to a high price region. So that dynamic will play out, and developers would weigh up the locational risks, will weigh up the quality of their resource for that particular location, will weigh up the connection costs, will weigh up a whole bunch of factors to then come up with you know, their choice of where to locate. And then the competitive market dynamics means each developer is doing the same thing. So that's why we have a market. We have an open access competitive market where really it's up to the developer to do their due diligence. If they have a competitive advantage over someone else, then it allows them to secure a site and connect. So that that dynamic would continue, and I see that continuing with potential for the offshore wind.
Right. Thank you. Staying on the wind aspect, there was a question around the South Australian data that you presented, and it's specifically around was the reduction in wind output due to lower wind or due to price and therefore dispatch, or was it an interconnector limit?
Yeah, I remember the slides. I think it was about 30 megawatts reduction compared quarter 4 20 or 21 compared to quarter 4 2020. Look, there's probably a range of factors. It could be the wind generators pulling their capacity because of the negative price exposure. It could be due to the underlying demand in South Australia for those particular periods being lower. So there's a host number of factors. I don't think we drill down. We notice those variations quarter by quarter, and as I mentioned, 30 megawatts is not a huge amount. The South Australian system can get up to 3,500 megawatts. So we're talking 1% of demand.
Okay, thank you. While you've got the Fcas slide, much of our conversation, I think, today has been around the importance, the impact, the pressure on Fcas. There's an earlier question talking about whether the volatility or the ramp, really, it's the ramp of solar morning and night. Can that be perhaps managed through curtailment and therefore reduce the requirement for Fcas, or alternatively, can you simply let everyone dispatch when they are and just have a Fcas market that responds to that?
Yeah, I'll try and almost paraphrase what that question is asking. We have the energy markets being co-optimized with the 8 Fcas markets. What that means essentially is that a service provider can optimally choose to either put the output into the energy market or have the output into the Fcas markets. And we have this thing called a trapezium. So it's a trapezium whereby you've got this envelope where, like I said, the generator can trade off whether they want energy exposure or exposure with the Fcas markets. And the dispatch engine doesn't really, it does an optimization. So it says for this particular 5 minutes, it's cheaper for the market and better for customers overall if the market dispatches this Fcas as opposed to using that capacity and dispatching it into the energy market. And that dynamic changes all the time. And the important thing is, as I mentioned before, if we have more large-scale batteries come into the market, and we have potentially other gas turbines come in, it's to encourage those other technologies to set up their plant so that they are able to supply their product into the Fcas markets. And that's the best way over the long run of ensuring that you get a competitive outcome. I think you're on mute, Adrian.
Yeah, no, I'm off mute, stopping the noise of the emails coming through. A few questions around the transmission network and renewable energy zones. Should they be prioritised? Should we get a hurry up in that space? you mentioned some constraints early on. If we were to prioritise, bring forward some of those projects, would it fundamentally change where we are and the market response overall? Or are they simply going as quickly as they can be?
Yeah, I mean, the whole renewable energy zones, you have the same issues with the traditional transmission build. So, you know, which is, can I get myself a corridor? What's the social impact? What's the land use for that transmission corridor? Is that competing with land that's used for farming? What's the social aspects in terms of the impact on communities? So all those issues don't go away when you have renewable energy zones. They're still there. So I know that New South Wales, the New South Wales roadmap and the Victorian arrangements, they're trying to tackle the social license issue. So that's going to be quite important to ensure that we balance the needs and requirements of a whole range of stakeholders, and that way we maximise the chance of getting timely transmission investment. So I'm hopeful that the arrangements you have in New South Wales and Victoria, and probably in Queensland also, would lead to a faster acceptance of the social license to build transmission, and therefore we get a more homogeneous NEM.
Right. Thank you. And, we have 3 remaining questions that I think are bundleable, and they're around a combination of bidding behaviour and particularly with respect to negative prices. If I'll try and again paraphrase all 3. One is really, are negative prices sustainable, and what's the longer term impact of that situation? The second element of it is that slide that you showed, that they become variable renewable energy is bidding at less negative prices, and the question is around what's causing that, what's underlying VRE not wanting to bid as negative as they were. And then the final one, why don't the thermal generators simply bid at -1,000 all the time to get in the game, and then take obviously a higher price at the end of the half hour?
Yep. Okay. Negative prices, they're not bad or good per se. It really depends on what side of the ledger. If you are a market customer and you're not contracted and you're taking pure spot exposure, negative prices is fantastic, because what essentially means is you're incentivized to consume and get paid for it. Awesome. If you're a battery, negative prices is not bad also, because once again, you've got storage, you've got an incentive to be charging when the prices are negative, and for that service, you're getting paid for it. So characterizing negative prices, it's good or bad, I think that's a bit simplistic. It's just a feature of the market settings. And I mentioned before, the market settings has an envelope, maximum price cap, market price floor, and any prices in between is an efficient price, because it says for that particular 5 minutes, this is the cleared price. And the dispatch engine optimizes a whole bunch of constraints to come up with that price. So that's the first thing. That's my first observation.
what
was parts 2 and 3, Adrian? To that question.
Yes, whether the bidding behaviour of thermal generators, why wouldn't they simply bid negative 1,000 all the time so that they actually get a place in the market?
Yeah, sure. To some extent, the thermal generators used to do that before the 5-minute settlement, because I explained earlier, if there was a price spike early on, then the averaging over the 6 dispatch periods, 5-minute dispatch periods, means that, even if they get 1 dispatch period at the maximum price gap of 15,000 over the 6 periods, even if they bid negative 1,000, they still get an average of about 2,200 megawatts, which is quite high. So it's a volume game prior to 5-minute settlement. But as I showed in that later slide, 5-minute settlement changes since October meant that you don't get that averaging over the 6 5-minute periods anymore. What spot price is applicable for that 5 minutes is what you get paid. So in the new 5MS environment, that incentive to bid at a negative 1,000, if you don't have a valid reason for doing it, I don't see generators doing, because they'll have to pay $1,000 to be generating, and they are incurring variable costs, fixed costs, and not recuperating any of that for that 5 minutes. So I don't see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third part of the question is, why have the variable renewable generators, looks like they've changed their bid structure from negative 1,000 for about 8,000 megawatts, and then they're starting to bid to the negative 50 to negative 100. Yeah, we don't know. That's the collective observation across the board. So I'm only hypothesizing that there might be some sort of contractual arrangement in place where the off-taker, for whatever reason, has told the generator, we don't like this negative $1,000 exposure. We want you to rebid back to more like the large generations renewable certificate price, which is trading about $40. We want you to bid on the opposite side, so that if you absolutely have to bid negative to maintain volume, then at least that volume can be offset by the revenue that you get from these certificates, and therefore they're rebidding more like a negative $100 to negative $50 mark. And that might be one reason. We haven't delved into the commercial reasons why we're seeing that pattern.
All right. Well, I think that pretty much ties up the presentation and the questions. Again, Kevin, thank you very much for the content, for the thought that you and AEMO always put into the dynamics report to give insight into what's happening for both market participants and for the rest of us who are enthusiastic and interested and are either price takers or simply observers. It really describes the way that the NEM operates, in that there are people who are involved intimately in it, and then there's a whole layer where the impacts of that involvement really do matter as well, and AEMO brings all that together. So thank you very much. Thank you to the participants. I think this has been the most the highest number we've had, and because it is online, it allows people to join from across the world, and I think again that highlights the interest in the NEM, and that it is a model for how the markets are changing globally. So again, thank you everyone for your participation. The recording will be on the Melbourne Energy Institute website. The newsletter was published today or yesterday, which contains further information as well. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Adrian. It was my pleasure to present today.
Thanks, Kevin. Farewell all.